factors that we should know about, like in looking at the creation of Israel and things that took place,
Mhm.
and why it's important in today's time that we know uh, about these things and not be ignorant of them. In some instances, it exposes fallacies that are held about certain things, and in others, it underlines the truth concerning certain matters. But from an Islamic standpoint, how do we look at the aspect of what happened with this in this particular instance and the things that come about it and how it played out? Undoubtedly, you could teach, and I'll go back to a couple of other things historically to look at, but there, undoubtedly, you can teach the class for 2 or 3 years
Mhm.
about the creation of the state of Israel and the role that um, how it came about, you know, out of World War One and the Treaty of Versailles. What role did America play in it? In terms of that officially, and what role in certain conceptualizations coming about at the time, because of the influence that American Jews were able to influence over what was known as the World Zionist Organization, and the things that took place. But from an Islamic standpoint, we can look at it from the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us in the Quran to do, and from the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and what happens when those things don't take place. What can be the end, the end result of what's happening. The Jews were the European Jews, not so much the Sephardic Jews, those Jews being born and raised in the Middle East, and let's say born and raised in Palestine. They had a long history of living, by most accounts, rather peacefully with the Palestinians who were Muslims. We also have to take a look and understand that not all of the Palestinians living in the Middle East at the time were Muslim. The very large percentage of them were, but there were also those Palestinians who were Christian. Okay, and so this circumstance, but by and large, they were able to live pretty amicably with each other. We know, in one sense, that when Salahuddin ibn Ayyubi, through Allah's grace and mercy, retakes Jerusalem in 1196. Now, it's important to note here that before I continue on about the first crusade, there were several crusades, but the only crusade that ended up with Jerusalem being captured by Christian knights was the first crusade, just the first. And finally, Jerusalem falls 1095, 1096. And what's established is called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it will last until Salahuddin Ayyubi, through Allah's grace and mercy, retakes Jerusalem and the other environs, around Jerusalem. And so here you have a Christian state, so to speak, in the midst of a sea of Muslims, because Syria is under Muslim control. Iraq is under Muslim control, and in other areas. So this Christian outpost now, the city in Arabic, Al-Quds, Jerusalem, and now you have established what is called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And you have the firm establishment of Christianity within this area. And this is important to understand too, because as we come into modern day terms, what's established at this point in time will have influence on other things that take place that I'm going to talk about and show some preference to. So the majority of the individuals, before we get back to the modern stage, the majority of the knights who came into Jerusalem on the first crusade were Catholics, just as we see Catholics today. But the Pope at this time has far more political power, which I didn't say religious power. He has far more political power that comes out of his position as being Pope. He's referred to as the Vicar of Christ, V-I-C-A-R, or Vicar of Christ, meaning Christ's representative on earth, or God's representative on earth.
Excuse me, Shay.
Yes.
I think someone has their...
Yeah, there's some feedback going on.
Okay.
Is it okay now? Hold on for a minute. I'm not muted, so.
It's clearer now.
It's clearer now? Okay. So this aspect of who I can hear it again for some reason. This aspect about the position that the Pope has is that when he sits in what is called his chair, some will call his throne, and he makes or delivers a edict from that chair while sitting there in official capacity is deemed to be infallible. That still holds true to the present day. Okay, so when he calls this first crusade, Pope Urban II, when he calls this crusade, Muslims are characterized in the most worst circumstance. Okay, the idea that Christian who are traveling to Jerusalem to make pilgrimage are being attacked. Muslim women, Christian women are being taken. People are being forced to become Muslim by the sword. All of these things is what he says. And he also puts the edict in there that indeed, if a crusader dies during the course of fighting for the crusade, then all of his sins will be forgiven and they'd be assured of paradise. And also the idea that if a crusader kills a Muslim civilian, let's say, that there'd be no punishment for it because they're infidels, so they don't have to worry about that. His response that he gets from calling this crusade is way beyond anything that he ever imagined. Because Europe is involved in a set of power struggles, wars being fought almost on a consistent basis. And how somehow or another, within the what is called a Holy Roman Empire, and in France and other areas, but these two primarily, in the German states, they focus on listening to this sermon and decide to take up, as it is called, to take up the cross, with the battle cry for them that God wills it. And they began to make this effort. And it's a tremendous effort to travel from Europe to what is called the Holy Land, and the route they have to take. And part of the reason this has been done is because the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople, who are at great odds with Catholics, with the Pope, each side looks at the other as being heretic. But when the patriarch of Constantinople sends a letter to Pope Urban II saying that if you do not come to our assistance, Christianity will cease to exist in this part of the world. So here is an important point to understand, that at this particular time, we're talking about the year 1095 to 1096, the only truly Christian bastion left in the Middle East is the Byzantine Empire. Everything else has fallen under the political sway of Islam. And if Byzantium or Constantinople falls at this point in time, there is no political entity in that region that can be identified as Christian. By the time 1095, 1096 comes about, several changes have taken place politically within the Ummah, if we can call it that, as about who is and who has power, who is strong. The Abbasid Caliphate is still there, but you have two other ones that come into play, the Seljuk Turks and the Safavid Empire. And the strange thing about the Safavid Empire is that it's Shia, has a lot of influence in, of all places, Egypt. And actually, believe it or not, is during the course of the First Crusade that the Safavids, because it's often said that the Seljuk Turks lost Jerusalem. They didn't have control of Jerusalem when Jerusalem fell. The Safavids did. Okay, so it's only the only time in history that Jerusalem was under quote unquote Shia control. But the Crusaders fight their way from Europe into the Holy Land, committing untold atrocities along the way, and eventually capture Jerusalem, set up this kingdom of Jerusalem that lasts for just about 100 years. Okay, Catholic Church is established in the region, and what will happen in the area that will become Lebanon, you have something called the Maronite Church. It's Catholic per se, but they put a strong emphasis on the worship of Mary. And even to this present day in Lebanon, you have Maronite Christians. Okay, and during the course of what will happen with the Lebanese Civil War, they play a very important part, and we'll see how that happens. So, but when Salahuddin ibn Ayyubi, through Allah's grace and mercy, recaptures Jerusalem in 1196 and its environs, there's several other crusades that take place. We all hear about Richard the Lionheart and all take place, but none of them are successful. So the age of the crusades comes to an end with Jerusalem and that area still under Muslim control. And it will stay like this. It will stay like this until the end of World War I. Okay? So what Salahuddin accomplishes in terms of the control, it will stay like this until the end of World War I. The Ottoman Empire has lasted until the end of World War I, has primary control of the area through one way or another in terms of looking at Syria, okay, and looking at, what will become, in Palestine. It even has the Sultan, it gets to the point where, if you're in Saudi Arabia, sometimes the king is referred to as the protector of the two holy places. But there'll become a time where the Turkish sultans will have this title as well. And they have tutelar control of of what becomes or will be Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. So these things are there. So how does Israel come about? What happens? Okay. To recap very quickly, World War I comes. And it's a world war in a true sense of the word, in terms of the countries from around the world, and where they fight and who are involved, with America being the latest one to get in 1917 with the sinking of the sinking of the Lusitania, which wasn't an American ship, but there were 1,500 Americans on board, and this gave the Wilson administration the fuel that it needed to declare war on Germany as such. But at the end of this war, and during the course of the war, but during the course of time up to World War I, the World Zionist Organization has been created. When you look at the tenets of Zionism, paraphrasing, it's about working, with all the might and wealth the Jews have in a concerted effort to produce a homeland for Jews. And this is what they set themselves to, what we call Zionism, this extreme Jewish nationalism sets themselves toward doing. In doing so, it means that they make some, not concessions, but some things come forth. When Jews, and I said, you find out what the Jewish agency was, important figures like David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Theodore Herzl, and others, when they look at Palestine, their catchphrase is people for a land that is a land without people. So they marginalize the Palestinians and anybody else living there, Arabs, right off the bat. Okay? As far as they're concerned, there's no people living there are, but they're looking at it from the standpoint, people for a land without people. They go back and say, where we want to have our homeland established, this is what God promised us. It's the same thing that you hear today, okay? And England has control of Palestine. Coming out of the Treaty of Versailles, England is given control of Palestine. It's also given control of what will become present-day Iraq. And France is given control of Syria. Lebanon is created out of the Versailles Treaty at the end of World War I, and France has control of Lebanon. England will take East Palestine and transform it into something called Transjordan, and it will become the Kingdom of Jordan that we know today. Okay, and so Azer Weitzman, who we talked about, because as a research physicist and chemist, in serving Britain during World War I, he's knighted, becomes Sir Azer Weitzman, and he's asked, what is it that he wants? What can a thankful British nation? What else can they do for him in light of what he did for Britain in terms of his military complex? And he says he wants the ability for Jews to be able to immigrate to the Holy Land. This starts the process. So the Jewish agency, these individuals, David Ben-Gurion, who will become Israel's first president, Golda Meir, who will be a prime minister as well, all these leading figures within the Zionist organization physically put themselves in Palestine, and they begin to buy property. A lot of the property that they buy is from Arab/Christian and or Muslim Arabs, who aren't thinking about the fact that in selling the land, that Palestinians people living on the land are going to be displaced. And so if we look at Israel today, the city of Tel Aviv was built on land that was bought primarily from Arabs, both Muslim and Christian Arab landowners. The same way with the port of Haifa and Jaffa and others. So this thing begins, and by the time the Palestinians realize what is happening, they're firmly entrenched. And not only that, England is committed to keeping this mandated territory. It's the old thing of the colonial attitude. England had a far-flung international empire, and they want to try to create the same thing again. We get into World War II, and the Holocaust, and and American Jews become involved in this movement to create a state of Israel. Now, this is where one of the fallacies come about. It's not to say that Jews don't have money. Okay, understand what we're saying here. They don't have money and influence. But the amount of money that was being claimed that Jews had and the amount of control that they had over certain things was not true. Okay, in that. But they did pull off a public relations coup once the American Jews get involved concerning the Holocaust. And they're able to make a shift here. Okay. So being anti-Semitic now becomes being anti-Jewish. Of course, Jews aren't the only Semites. If we're looking at the aspect of individuals who speak Semitic languages, and Arabic is a Semitic language. So in some senses, then Arabs are looked at as well as being Semites, but they're able to get the context within the confines that if a person is anti-Semitic, they're anti-Jewish. Bump the rest of the people who may be Semites. Now this term refers to a person being strictly anti-Jewish. And within the context of American politics, this plays some influence because when the question, after Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies and Harry Truman becomes president, the question comes up about Israel, especially after World War II and Germany has been defeated and Japan has been defeated. But the question comes up about the aspect about, the world's, the Zionists, they want this territory. They want a land for themselves. And when you read the documentation, Truman's closest advisors tell him not to do it. They, don't do it. And he asked them why. He said, because if you look at the world that it is now, there are far more Arabs in the world that we're eventually going to have to deal with and want to have, as our allies in the projection of stopping the spread of communism than there are Jews. So for any number of reasons, that one being the foremost in light of what is going to be called a Cold War, don't do it. But within the Democratic Party at the time, Jews aren't the most wealthiest, but they make some of consistently, Truman can go to them for financial contributions. And he becomes very conducive to them. And so when he's asked one time about why did he vote for there to go along at the UN for the creation of the state of Israel? He says, well, the truth of the matter is I don't have any Arab constituents, but I do have Jewish constituents. And this sort of cements the view that Israel has a strong say about controlling what happens in the American government when it comes to its future and the Mideast. And this is not to say it's not the case, but there's some other variables there that have to be looked at. Okay, so 1948, you have the creation of the state of Israel. What are the Palestinians doing? They are resisting. England has its hands full on both sides of the coin. They're trying to suppress the Israelis, but now there's the Israelis or the Jews, not Israelis yet, the Jews leading up to 1948 have come to the point of saying, we have to establish a Jewish homeland by any means necessary. If that means fighting the British until they leave, that means what we have to do, and we fight the Palestinians as well. Okay, so the last time we met, I asked for someone to, I think, Imam Radi, it was you, I think, to ask to look up Deir Yassin and what it was, because we want to take a look at the vehemence of what's taking place here in this battle for control of Israel, of the land that Israel is going to be formed on. So did you get a chance to look it up?
Yes, but Deir Yassin wasn't mentioned.
It wasn't.
No,
Oh my goodness. That's amazing. Okay.
I had Haganah, Irgun, and the Stern Gang.
Right.
So I have all of them.
Okay. Okay, I'll explain what Deir Yassin was. Okay. There you see was a
That's
Palestinian.
that is. I'm sorry for disturbing you. That is Yasin, Dar Yasin, same as in Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So there you're seeing is a Palestinian village. And by
Right.
this time, area of Palestine is divided up into zones, not officially by the British, but there are areas where the Palestinians control and areas where the Jews control. And Deir Yassin lies within the area under Jewish control. So Imam Radi mentioned two groups, Irgun, IRGUN, and then another organization called the Stern Gang. These are, as he will attest, these are two very extreme Jewish Zionist organizations. And when you look at Israel and the Jews who come to it, Sephardic Jews look at them and say, like, what kind of Jews are these? What I call the Ashkenazi Jews, the European Jews. And European Jews coming into, all of them coming into Palestine aren't practicing Jews. Some of them are socialists. Some of them by this time are leaning into aspects of Marxism and other things. But they're all committed Zionists in terms of the aspect of creating a homeland for the Jews by any means necessary. This is very important to understand. And it takes some time for the Palestinians to catch up onto what is happening. That at first is sort of like, to a certain extent, welcome the Jews there. But then at some point they begin to realize, wow, they're talking about getting rid of us. And so they begin to resist. Deir Yassin is a village within the Jewish controlled area that is set upon by elements from Irgun and the Stern Gang. What they did in Deir Yassin was atrocious. A team of Red Cross workers from Scandinavia, from Norway, get into the village because they hear the gunfire. And they get into the village just as Irgun, the elements from Irgun and the Stern Gang are, wrapping up the operation. The men from Deir Yassin were gone. They were out in the area where they would harvest crops. And it was made it virtually almost impossible for them to get back. So what you had in Deir Yassin were women, children, elderly men and women, okay? And some women who were pregnant. The accounts by the Red Cross workers of what they witnessed in Deir Yassin, they talk about Palestinian women having their stomachs ripped open and their fetuses snatched out and their brains smashed out, heads smashed open against walls. They find 7, some say 9 Palestinian women that had this happen to them, their stomachs cut open and their embryos withdrawn. The atrocities and the deaths are amazing. And here it's important to point out, there is another group, I don't know, Imam Radi, if I gave it to you to look at, called the Haganah. Okay, the Haganah is what eventually will become the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli army, their professional army. And coming out of World War II, Israel, those who will fight for the wars that take place, especially in 1948, many of the Jews who fight for America during World War II take their combat experience and go to volunteer to be in the Haganah. So the Haganah is really a professional military organization, and it's going to be fighting against Arab armies who have them outnumbered but don't have the professional training or combat experience as they do, because they didn't fight during World War II primarily. Okay, and the Jews do. Not only that, a lot of equipment, especially American equipment during World War II, is, we would say in today's terms, are stolen by Jewish individuals and housed in Israel. So when World War II ends, Israel, the Jews in Palestine aren't defenseless. They're very well trained. They understand the aspects of command and control, communications. And so when the war comes, as they know it is in 1948, once the state is established, they're ready for it. In that, Arab armies are big. But I'll talk about that in a minute or so. But the Jews had the advantage of closed circles of communication, so to speak. But in Deir Yassin, the atrocities are horrendous. And so what Ergen, who's under the control by a guy by the name of Vladimir Jabotinsky, after his death, a person who will become Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, a ultra Zionist, they begin to go around with loudspeakers in cars and telling other Palestinians, if you don't want to have happen to you what happened at Deir Yassin, you should leave. And this begins the Palestinian exodus of Palestinians picking up, taking what they can, and leaving Palestine. And so what happens when they leave? Jews come into the land and to the houses, their possessions, because there's no one there right now to protect, as they see it, them from this happening again. Later on down the line, you will have the creation of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is headed by Yasser Arafat. And it's amazing to note that Yasser Arafat's uncle was the last mufti of Jerusalem. It wasn't by happenstance that Yasser Arafat became leader of the PLO from its inception. His family had a long history of upholding high religious office in Palestine and being respected as such. His uncle was the last mufti of Jerusalem before World War II breaks out, and his uncle actually travels to Germany and spends a large amount of time in Berlin with Hitler, because they're both of the manifest hatred of the Jews, of Jews. So this begins the Palestinian exodus. With over 2 to 3 years' time, some 500,000 Palestinians leave Palestine. And in 1948, the state of Israel is established. The first war takes place. Israel is able to hang on and win. They're fighting a combination of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. And that's another, what is called the United Arab Republic, is another story in and of itself. So this creation of Israel is a long process, somewhat of a complicated one, but now it's a reality, okay? And when you look at it from an Islamic standpoint, the very things that, and not being judgmental, but in observing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had gave us through the time of the Prophet Sallallahu in resisting the things that happened in Palestine, they don't happen, okay? And when you have a situation amongst the Palestinians themselves, like I said, it wasn't a united Muslim front that went up against what now becomes the state of Israel. Some of the Palestinians are Marxists. Some of them call themselves communists, socialists. And they're always under this umbrella of the PLO. And then there's so many dichotomies and arguments that exist amongst the leadership of quote unquote the PLO in terms of this. So that becomes the situation. And so here we are now with Israel in terms of that, the current president or premier who's under heat, Netanyahu, his father was one of the foremost Zionists at the time, working for the establishment of the state of Israel. Okay, and we need to be aware of this because that's not going to go away. You know, in terms of that, we also need to be aware that in more instances than not, Muslims, sometimes we are our own worst enemies. And many individuals, Palestinians who I've talked to, has talked about that fact. You know, that amongst the Palestinian, you know, leadership, they see things, they observe things, and you know, a person that I knew in, for example, in when I was in Florida, his brother was one of the major members of Hamas, and they didn't get along because of the positions that Hamas has taken on some things. So now you have Palestinians fighting against Palestinians, and you know, and killing each other. You know, groups. You know, in terms of this, and as long as that happens and you know and continues, then the aspect of being successful against recouping what they lost or having a right to return is not going to happen.
It's not next to my bed.
You know, it's not going to happen. You know, so any questions at all? None.
The prophet.
Yeah.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
The prophet, praise and peace be upon him, was sent as a guide for us, not just spiritually, but also he was the best at war.
She already got
he was the best example for us in everything. And the Palestinians are in such a situation that they should take from our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam how he dealt with the pagans and who they became.
Nah.
He could have taken a negative position and took an arrogant position and said, you know, my way or the highway. He could have done that, but he showed us through his example that peace works for us.
No.
You know, if they are an oppressed people, they're hurting. Those Jews, we already know, as you pointed out in Yasin,
No.
how they feel about Arabs.
Right.
So, and we have Palestinians that feel the same about them.
Right.
They would take a peaceful position. They need, you know, they don't even have access in some of these little villages to sewer systems.
Right.
Clean water. You know, just say, look, no problem. We're not going to fight with you people anymore. And then work. Go to work on the state of the Palestinians. Don't just hopelessly, you know, you throw in bombs, 2-3 bombs into the Jewish areas, and they throwing 200-300 in yours. You know, and there's no, Saudi's not coming to help you. Iran is not coming to help you. Egypt is not helping you. You understand that their way out seems so simple, you know, but they consider it, I guess, an insult to to take the peaceful route.
Right.
They even had, I don't know if it's still the same. I know that at one point in their constitution was that they would never, ever forgive the Jews for what they did at Dar Yassin. And
yeah, it's still there.
yeah, you know what I mean? Now, you coming to the table, and there's no way to to reach an agreement with you because you don't want to hear anything. And that was not the way of the Prophet, praise and peace be upon him.
Definitely wasn't. Definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
And I think that if they had done that, if they had people among them, more spiritual people than political people among them, that would follow the messenger, and they could recuperate. I don't know how long it would take them. They could recuperate. They could get the Jewish state. They could get world sympathy. As it is now, nobody wants to even deal with them because they're going to blow you up. You know what I mean? Right. They're worried about repercussions from you if we treat you right.
No.
You know what I mean?
You know, the point you made about, I mean, what I agree with you in its entirety, but for emphasis, I remember when you talk about, the spiritual leadership aspect of it. Now, Yasser Arafat, who was the leader of the PLO, he's long since passed away, was, recognized as being Muslim. Okay. But I remember a 60-minute program that was done, and they were focusing on him. And the interviewer, they showed him in Jerusalem. He had been able to visit Jerusalem. And he was, at Masjid al-Aqsa, Dome of Rock, but he was making dua. And in listening to what he was saying, he began to call upon, because his wife was Christian, he began to call upon Isa, alayhi salam, asking, oh, Jesus, provide us with, aid and this, that, and the other. And the commentator for 60 minutes said, he said, I found that prayer that he made quite strange. And so the person who was talking to him, it might have been Ed Bradley, said, well, why? He said, because Muslims only pray to Allah. He said to pray to any entity other than Allah commits the greatest sin, which in their book, the Quran, who they worship, says that he will not forgive. And so, and he says, so to hear Yasser Arafat publicly and openly call upon and ask Jesus for help and aid, so forth and so on, he said that's really strange. He said, now, I don't know if it's because of his wife being Christian or having to placate the Christians who are amongst the PLO. He said, but for a Muslim to do that, that is an act of shirk. And he said the word shirk. He said, one of the worst sins that you can, he said, this is a sin in the Quran. He said that I know from Muslims who I know, who have told me this is a sin that Allah says that he will not forgive. And he said, here is the leader of their organization calling upon Jesus to give them aid, victory, so forth and so on. He said, I'm just really astounded. He said, the guy said, I don't even know what to say.
Right.
Said, because I never thought I would see that happen.
Right. He stepped way outside the religion for that one.
Yeah, he sure
did. That's what I was talking about. Political.
Right.
Not following the messenger. Because if he wanted to play politics in his prayer, which we don't want to play in our dua, he could have asked for blessings on all of the prophets,
No,
which
exactly.
would have been acceptable. He wouldn't have singled out Isa, you know.
No.
But
And the thing about it, I knew that the guy wasn't fabricating something against Yasser because they filmed it and they played. I watched him do it, and I just sat there and said to myself, "Okay, no. How can you expect to now to enlist Allah's aid when you've done the one thing and call it upon someone that cannot aid you at all?"
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and a matter of fact, he was even asked about that.
No.
He was asked about it. He couldn't even give an answer for it, except to say there are Christians within the PLO.
Yeah.
You know, so that, but again, you know, historically here, not to dwell on it, is, you know, is for those of us who are going to meet and, you know, and cover these different topics, is about looking at what happens when the Sunnah is not followed. There's no success in not following the Sunnah.
Exactly.
It's one thing to not know. You know, in my mind, it's one thing to not know, but to know and then not follow. And as you said, Imam Radi, looking at the example of the Prophet and what he's done, you know, and what he did, and the success that came for it. You know, I mean, imagine he could have went back into Mecca and killed everybody in there.
Yeah.
The things that had happened.
Exactly. In fact, the companions were ready to do that.
Exactly. 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 And he did otherwise. He did otherwise. You know, and so that whole circumstance, you know, and you know, and so, and then you have, you know, I know what the time that I was in Saudi Arabia, you know, in Riyadh, if there was one people there especially when King Faisal was king and King Fahd, who went overboard to in sense aid them in what they were trying to achieve, you know, to get the right of return, Palestinian homeland. Okay, they did. You know, Palestinian students could come in and go to the Saudi universities, to King Saud University or Mohammed bin Saud or the other schools that open up, study anything that they wanted to. Where I was living at the time, I was at the first time, what was considered the Palestinian embassy, you know, was about 4 blocks from my house. Well, the first embassy that got built in the new embassy quarters, one of the first embassies, was one for the Palestinians, $275 million. You know, extended to build them and grant them, as far as Saudi was concerned, you know, diplomatic status. But I looked at it and I said, well, you know, if you go into Palestine, you know, you have Hamas and you have Al Fatah. They fight each other like cats and dogs. So if we look historically at what happened, the great fitna that takes place, you know, there's a lesson to be learned that, like, you know, like us fighting and killing each other is totally against everything from Allah and the Prophet. They don't look at it, you know, or if they do look at it, they don't adhere by it.
Right.
You know, and you know, in terms of that, you know, so but here we see in the larger context, you know, if I go back to World War I, you know, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire at the time, when the offer was made to him by the Germans, well, you know, you've lost a lot of your, you know, Egypt was, you know, controlled by England, you used to have control of England, you know, France is chomping at the bit to get at Syria, Well, if you fight with us and we win, we'll give you your property back. We'll give you everything that you've lost to our enemies. We'll return back to you. Nobody asks the question, well, what happens if you lose? What's going to happen? Okay, and in losing,
It's 3 o'clock.
it got divided up and it went way downhill from there.
Yeah.
Way downhill from there. So there are lessons there for us to learn about the importance of paying attention not only to the Quran, but to the Sunnah, and learning about as much of it as we can as the Prophet ﷺ intended.
Right.
That's it. Sister Andrea, how are you?
Okay, I have a quick question. I question. So maybe you mentioned this in another class when I wasn't present, but who is the person that speaks for the Palestinian people today?
Okay, you have something called a Palestinian Authority. Okay, you still have Hamas. There's two major Palestinian organizations and some others, but the two major ones are Al-Fatah and Hamas. Al-Fatah is recognized as the political authority of the Palestinian Authority, okay? And its leader, Mohammed Abbas, I think his name is, he's the leader, okay? Hamas is looked at as an extreme faction of them, and that these two groups, that they don't get along with each other at all. So this guy, whoever the leader of, and his first name is Muhammad, I think it's Muhammad al-Abbas, he is the leader of what is called a Palestinian Authority. He's also the political leader of the organization called Al-Fatah. Okay.
I think I heard his name mentioned in the news.
And Hamas is another organization. Out of the two, Hamas is supposed to be the most religious, but Allah is best to know about that one.
Yeah.
About that. You see certain things, and this is what my friend whose brother was one of the leaders of Hamas said. He said it's hard to look at people, and see any commonality when you're wearing Hart Schaffner marked suits, driving around in Mercedes, and people are having their lights cut off. They don't have food, this, that, and the other. It becomes a really hard thing to sell, and so a lot of, as Imam Radi, in my opinion, very correctly pointed to, the problems that the Palestinians have, okay, in large part is because in many instances they've turned their backs on the Quran and the Sunnah. Every other aspect about being able to achieve, to end their plight, their oppression, is looked at and done other than following the Quran and the Sunnah as it should be. And that for them or anybody else who are claiming to be Muslims is going to cause problems, in that, so that whole circumstance now is one nobody except Allah knows if and when the Palestinian condition will get better in terms of that, and it's enough to say the Palestinians were places where they got kicked out of. For example, in Jordan, the Palestinians were there. King Hussein, the first King Hussein, he opened up Jordan, allowed the Palestinians to come in, and ultimately he ends up kicking them out because of an attempt by them that was found out about, that they were going to try to remove him from his position. And so they became a real thorn in the side of the Jordanians. The Palestinians, in their history of Exodus, have something called Black September. Black September is when King Hussein moved to remove the PLO, the political organization, out of Jordan. it was a natural spot for the Palestinians to go because any Jordanian family, and more, you know, in most cases that you look at, you will find they may carry a Jordanian passport, but their lineage is Palestinian because Jordan was made out of East Palestine. The English made it, call it Transjordan, and King Hussein, who supposedly was able to trace his lineage back to the Prophet himself, Sallallahu was his first king, you know, and was his king for a long time. Okay, but he kicked them out. He's, you know, you can't stay here. They end up in Lebanon. Okay, and in 1975, the Lebanese Civil War takes place. You know, starts, and it's the Palestinians are in, you know, part and parcel involved in that. Okay, and that's when you see this group that I talked about before. Historically, the Maronite Christians come into vogue. One of the things that comes out of what France did before it left Lebanon and gave it its independence, that caused it, was part of the political reasons leading to this civil war in 1975 that lasted for 12 years and was one of the most brutal that you would ever see, was that the French put into place a stipulation in granting independence to Lebanon that no Muslim could ever be head of the country. So you're talking about a point where Christians are in the minority, but they hold the most powerful, you know, positions, especially that of being president. You know, and this was something that caused huge problems. Okay, it leads to civil war in which the Palestinians are involved in. And so one of the things that happens, the hatred that Imam Radi and I both have talked about, exhibited by the Zionists towards Arabs, is portrayed in modern times two of the worst massacres that ever take place. And they take place in the 1981-82 invasion of Israel into Lebanon. And Menachem Begin is the prime minister. There's a massacre that takes place at two Palestinian refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila. And one of the things that, how did this happen? Israel is, you know, like the bombing of Lebanese cities in Sidon and Tyre and elsewhere is terrible. But a peace agreement is reached through the UN that says that the Palestinian, the PLO fighters, have to leave Lebanon. The Palestinian, you know, with Yasser Arafat, and they agree that the Israelis want them to leave their weapons behind. And they say, no, we're not. So the agreement is made for them to leave and to take their weapons with them. But now this leaves their families unprotected. There is a Christian, Maronite Christian organization called the Phalange, spelled capital Phalange, Phalange. Israel assumes, Menachem Begin assumed the responsibility of protecting the Palestinians, and Israel would protect the Palestinian, you know, so, you know, their wives and children that were left behind. Well, that doesn't happen. In the two places early in the morning, I forgot the day, but early in the morning, the Phalange attacked these two refugee camps, and the Israeli soldiers who are there to guard and should have been there to stop them from coming in are nowhere to be found. The Phalange go into both camps and they kill over 432 Palestinian women, children, and men, women, and children, and elderly. Okay, it's enough of a atrocity that Menachem Begin has to resign as being prime minister, because the fault for what happened is put at his place. And during the time that the atrocities are taking place, the Israeli military knows what's happening, but they never make one step into the village. I mean, into the two refugee camps to stop the killing. In the morning, in the break of day, the phalangists leave, but the carnage that they left behind was atrocious. Okay, so once again, you know, and then this just more entrenched especially for Palestinians, you know, fighters who had left with Yasser Arafat, the fact that that their families had been preyed upon, you know, that the promise to keep them safe wasn't kept, further entrenched the hatred that was there in terms of what Imam Radi was talking about. Okay. And so it's an ever continuing vicious cycle, that you see. And it's not to say that the attitude that many Israelis have about Arab, i.e. and or Muslims, or Palestinians, be they Christian and or Muslims, is that we talk about this word that, you know, especially that Orthodox Jews and Hasidic Jews use, goyim. That, you know, the aspect of being goyim is almost like you're subhuman. They just, you know, they look at it and say, oh, this word just means somebody who's not Jewish. But within the context inside of Jewish society, goyim has a far more reaching meaning than just simply not being Muslim. The goyim is the one or the person that the Jew, in terms of the Talmud, can do anything to and not have to worry about repercussions. This is why in 1451, the French king, after having the Old Testament and the Talmud translated, he kicked the Jews out of France. He kicked them out of France. You know, there was one part of the Talmud that stated basically that if the Goyim, meaning non-Jews, ever found out what is said about them in the Talmud, they would kill us outright. You know, so, but one thing, as Imam Radi pointed out, in confronting oppression and repression in terms of being Muslims, there's no victory if it's not done in the aspect of following the Quran and the Sunnah. I mean, that's, you know, and people will hear us, myself and Imam Radi say that, well, what about this? What about that? You know, the bottom line is victory comes when the Muslims do that.
That's it. Exactly.
Right? When the Muslims do that. You know, you look at Salahuddin ibn Ayyubi, and one of the things, besides his being a great military strategist, and so on, that you read about him, that even his opponents said about him, they had no doubt about his devotion and his sincerity of being Muslim.
Yeah.
You know, and or we look at the Sahaba and what Allah blessed them to accomplish. But if we Muslims tend to solve these circumstances and others without paying attention to the Quran and the Sunnah, then there's no victory there.
Yeah.
For sure. Thank you so much. So next week, same station, same time.
Yes.
All right, Sheikh. Shukran Jazeel.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hey, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.